everyone, and welcome to a Mulberry Talent Partners leadership conversation. My name is Kelsey Daly, and I am the Talent Acquisition Partner here at Mulberry. So a little bit about Mulberry. We are a full-service staffing and recruiting agency headquartered in Portland, Oregon, with an office in the Silicon Valley. We specialize in the placements of human resources, professional and financial office, payroll, and operations positions with temp to hire, direct hire, and temporary opportunities. I would encourage you to check out our website at mulberrytalent.com to see our full suite of service offerings and check out our previously recorded leadership and career conversations. So jumping into introductions, we are joined today by Lauren Francis and Chris Sheesley. Lauren is our wonderful founder and president. She started Mulberry back in May of 2017 and comes with over 25 years of talent acquisition experience. Our speaker today is Chris Sheesley. Through his company, In Accord, Chris and his team fix interpersonal conflict in workplaces. Having made conflict resolution his sole profession, as well as his passion for over 30 years, Chris is among the most experienced and well-known conflict management consultants on the West Coast. He's helped people overcome discord in many organizations you've heard of, such as Providence Health Systems, OHSU, Georgia Pacific Source Health Plans, Norm Thompson, Northwest Natural, and countless other companies and government agencies. He's also served on 15 professional mediation rosters. Among his special projects are constructive conflict training for Metro Government, Xenium HR, Portland General Electric, Fairbanks, Alaska, the Port of Portland, and others. Facilitation of the regulatory streamlining process for Oregon's Workers' Compensation Division, advanced workplace mediation training for Intel, OHSU, City of Portland, and others. In Accord has exclusive strategic alliances with HR Answers and Xenium HR. So it's my pleasure to introduce Chris Sheesley, the conflict resolver, and Lauren Francis. So without further ado, I'd like to pass it off to Chris.
Kelsey, thank you very much for that lovely introduction. And hello, everybody. It's nice to be here with you all. Looking forward to a 45-minute power session here on how to handle conflict in the workplace. Folks, I wanted to give you a prelude on what we're doing together today. We're basically going to explore the 4 insights into workplace conflict. And this is distilled information from my 32 years of wading into human conflict in the workplace and helping people resolve conflict in the most effective ways possible. We're going to cover four places. The first one is the cost of conflict. So what is the impact of conflict on organizations, organizational life, and the people within them? Then we're going to take a look at the 4 barriers that tend to get in the way. These are the recurring themes, the things that I always see in every case I've ever handled, over 2,000 cases. What are the 4 things that always seem to emerge that lead to conflict and at the front end appear to be insurmountable? So we're going to look at those 4 barriers. Then we're going to take a slight detour into the arena of impartiality and the power of impartiality to help people in leadership positions be more effective in resolving conflict within their organizations. And then, not going to leave you hanging, we're going to come back to those 4 barriers and we're going to drill down into those, revisit them a little bit, and help you consider ways to actually break through those seemingly intractable problems that we're going to set up at the beginning of our presentation. So that's the journey we're on. I hope that's what you signed up for when you joined us today. And we're going to begin the journey. First thing is to ask you, really, most of you have done some informal thinking about the cost of conflict. And so I'm curious what kinds of ways you measure. How do you measure conflict in your organizational experience as you've seen it happen? What's the cost of conflict on organizations and the people within them? So chat away.
Yes. Okay. We have some rolling in already. We have turnover, inability to get work done, loss of employees, burnout, low morale, loss of productivity, staff time, frustration, turnover again, bad feelings, low retention.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that's very depressing, isn't it? Conflict resolution, not always the most cheerful subject, but by the end of this, you won't be able to wait till your next conflict in the workplace to try out all these new skills. So the things that you all mentioned there and that Kelsey highlighted for us there are common things that we hear in Accord in terms of encountering conflict. it's hard to quantify this information, like what is the cost and how do you quantify that? But there has been some interesting research. So I wanted to share with you some of those astonishing statistics. First one that we came across was the idea of performance problems. And the idea that in this study, 65% of performance problems were caused by the inability to get along with other people, which is pretty amazing because when we think about performance, we usually think that it's a skill deficit or lack of motivation. And there's lots of different ways that we approach and try to train out of or work out of performance problems. But the truth is, a lot of it, the majority of it in the study at least, highlights conflict and the inability to get along with other people. So that's one, and I think Kelsey mentioned that in her list there that read off from you all. The second one, and we heard this too, is departures, the idea of people leaving. If you filter out layoffs, then 50% of departures can be traced back to the inability to work together effectively with each other. That can be with peers or across the hierarchy, but 50% of loss of employees is due to chronic unresolved conflict, an especially acute issue these days with the shortages of workers. And then the third astonishing statistic for you all is that managers, a lot of you on this Zoom today, spend about 18% of your time dealing with conflict between your employees. If you translate that down to raw numbers, that's a day a week that the typical manager ends up spending churning and working with conflict. So quite a challenging dynamic, and conflict clearly has impacts on these points that I raised as well as the others that you highlighted. So the question for us becomes, how about you all and how you feel about conflict and your relationship with it? So I want to ask you a few questions. These were in the pre-survey that we put out. We got some nice responses and appreciated folks that took some time to share their thoughts and sentiments and to answer these questions on a scale from 1 to 5. So this is the impact of conflict on your organizations. And the number scale you were given was a 1, which is like the perpetual Woodstock. Everybody gets along and everything's fine, all the way down to 5, which was kind of Armageddon, and we're lucky to survive each day because conflict is so intense within our organizations. So I want you to get a number in your mind that speaks to that scale. 1, no conflict. 5, everybody's getting along. And then we can take a look at those numbers, but the average on the score that people put in from the pre-surveys was a 4. So that's the number we saw, pretty high on the scale, as you can see, from the people that were willing to share their sentiments about their own organizational experience. The next question was about how comfortable you are with conflict in your organization and just generally your approach and feel around conflict. So I'd like you to kind of contemplate that for yourselves again. What do you think your number would be? 1 to 5, 5 being, in this case, very comfortable, 1 not at all comfortable, and I'm terrified of conflict. So the scale from our pre-survey is 3.8. So leaning towards the more competent side of things. Another question we asked you all was effectiveness. So how effective are you in dealing with conflict? And in this regard, we saw 3.8. So as you can see, this kind of echoes what I experienced in working with professionals, is that conflict is impactful on your organization. There are challenges, but that generally people that get into leadership roles have some core competencies and abilities and comfort around conflict, but you could always use another nudge. So my goal is to help you all. If you're thinking a number, I'd like to add a 0.5 to whatever your number was so that you can leave this presentation a little more confident and comfortable and skillful in dealing with conflict in your organizations. All right, so to help you do that, we're going to explore some easy to remember and easy to apply techniques and skills and insights that you can use to be more effective in conflict in your organization. So conflict is expensive, it's challenging, and we're going to look at what makes conflict so hot and uncomfortable, looking at these 4 barriers, and then we're going to give you solutions to those problems. So I'm going to start by sharing a little anecdote. This is a case that I dealt with as a mediator, and it involved 2 people. There was Shelley, and she was the boss, and then she had an employee named Ted. Now, Shelley thought that she was doing pretty well, felt that she had good rapport with her team, and that she was trying to do her best. And one day, though, she heard a knock on her office door, and it was the boss, like the boss's boss, like the person you don't usually expect to knock on your door and come into your office. And she was quite alarmed to have this person knocking on her door. She came in, sat down, and started the conversation. Pretty early, it was revealed that he was there because she had been accused of violence in the workplace, which was utterly startling to her and out of left field as far as she could tell. So he said, yeah, you've been accused of violence in the workplace. That was alarming to her. And she, of course, asked why, what's going on. Turned out that Ted, her administrative assistant, had gone to this person, the highest up in the organization, and said that she was being inappropriate and making him uncomfortable, that she had outed him in a public way for not performing his job, and also was belittling him. And the perfect match on the perfect pool of gasoline was this moment where, as they were discussing a little project, she said, oh, Ted can do that, with the wave of the hand and everything. And that for him translated into this concept of violence in the workplace, that he felt that she was being actually violent towards him emotionally and how she was treating him. So he took that to the leadership person, and that's what began this conflict and brought us to mediation. So by the time they got to an accord, they were siloed. There were team members that were on his side and team members that were on her side. Somebody was about to lose their job, and this thing was really going off the cliff. So that was the setup. And what was particularly galling to Shelley in this case was that she actually thought she had good rapport with Ted. She had inherited him as her administrative assistant, but she had inherited him in that role, and that she was trying to redefine his job so that it would work for her. He interpreted that as, she's chipping off parts of my job I love and is no longer really being effective as my leader and is trying to cut me out, basically. One other little anecdote here was kind of interesting is they were actually carpool buddies, in the sense that once in a while they'd end up in a carpool situation where she would drive him into work. And so she thought she had that kind of a rapport too. So to get the boss coming into her office was just completely devastating to her. So that's the scenario that I want to portray for you, so that we can use that case as an example, looking at the 4 barriers that I mentioned. So the first problem that comes up in conflict is the idea of violated expectations. And that is that people break rules that are important to us. And they do it in ways that really feel offensive and challenge how we think people should treat us. So in my experience, the triggering event is almost always an expectation that one side has that the other side has in some way violated. And the challenge for us as people, as colleagues, as coworkers, as managers, is that people don't have a sign on their cubby wall that says, here are my expectations about how I want to be treated. We don't put it on our t-shirts, and we don't carry a sign around saying, this is how I expect people to treat me. How do we know when somebody has violated our expectation? When they've done it. When you've already stepped on the landmine, and when you've already brought up that expectation and you've already violated it in some way. So that's a real challenge, and it's really the triggering event in so many conflicts that we handle in accord. We all have these expectations, and they're easily triggered. So as you think about Shelley and Ted, I'd like you just to consider that for a moment. What were some of Shelley's expectations, or what were her rules of how Ted should act? Inversely, what were some of Ted's rules about how his supervisor should act?
Ted should accept the changes she made in a respectful way. Ted probably wanted a consultation. He should have brought to her first to communicate his needs and concerns with their relationship. Someone said Ted may have felt maligned by his leadership or dismissed by his leadership.
Yeah.
Expectation of Ted to speak with Shelley first. Shelley expected Ted to communicate his concerns with her.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, good. So yeah, you all got the theme there. You're hitting all the marks there. And of course, we're not in their head, and I've only given you a very small snippet of a very complicated case, but that you get the feel for it, that those are the kind of things that people expect. They haven't talked about it in advance, and the triggering event has plunged them into and towards conflict. And conflict tends to grow over time. A lot of us have had that experience where one thing happens, and then there's a reaction, and then a counter reaction, and the conflict tends to grow. So in conflict theory, you can't get out of a conflict 101 course without hearing the concept of conflict spirals, the idea that conflict begets conflict and it tends to grow. And all of that starts with a violated expectation. Okay, so that's bad news number 1. This one speed bump in the road is expectations that get violated. The second thing that happens is that people then become victimized by this violation that the other person has caused. So that's a consequence of the expectation that's been violated. And people feel like they're the target of the other person's violation. And it's really this kind of flamethrower they feel is aimed at them, and that the other person is doing it intentionally, that they're trying to do harm to them, etc. And it's not just scapegoating. And this is a really important point I want to emphasize for you all, is that when people talk about conflicts with me in a private setting, if I'm meeting one-on-one with one of my parties, I'm going to hear a story that includes words like, I'm feeling like a victim, they're doing to this on purpose, I've never been treated like this before. Okay, you're going to hear all of that. I'm going to hear all of that. And then I'm going to go across the hall, metaphorically, talk to the other side. What do you think I'm going to hear there? The same story. It's the same feeling of feeling like they're a victim of the other person's violation. And the point I want to emphasize for you all is that they're not making it up just to make themselves look better. They're not making it up to try to portray themselves as the good person or whatever. They're doing it because it's a real conviction. They genuinely feel like they're victims. In fact, you and me and everybody else who gets into a conflict situation, you're going to have that feeling. So we've had a violation of an expectation, and then we feel like victims. So these are the first two steps that happen. How were Ted and Shelley feeling like victims in that case that I provided for you all? Here's some chats on how those folks were experiencing victimhood.
Somebody said they were blindsided by this. Neither Ted nor Shelley understood the perspective of the other side. Threatened by job loss. Ted being told he will complete certain tasks. Neither one seems to have any control over the situation. Disrespected. She didn't value my work. Ted felt dismissed.
Okay, all right, good. So you all already know the script, and you're just spot on with all of those observations about how this translated for both of them as feeling like they were victims of the situation and of the other person. All right, so we have two barriers now in place to conflict resolution, and it only gets worse because we got two more to go. But first one is our broken rules, and then there's victimhood. So the third one is, if you're breaking rules about how people should treat me, and I'm feeling like a victim as a result, then what do I think about you? Or what does person A think about person B? They think that person is the villain, that they're doing something intentionally, that they're a bad person, that they're out to do harm to them and to others likely as well. And this gets to be quite remarkable. I've had cases where people just can't take off this filter that they have in place now to look at the other person. They can't see them as somebody who has friends and family and colleagues that they do get along with. They always see them as a bad person. Imagine that Ted's sitting there and Shelley comes by and she says, I'm leaving for a meeting. And he says, okay, where are you going to be? When are you going to be back? Now, you got two choices here. You can think that Shelley's going to think, oh, Ted's asking where I'm going. What a great administrative assistant. He's on the ball. He's trying to keep track of me so he can tell other people where I am. That's option A. Option B is she's thinking this meddling, overly assertive and overly aggressive administrative assistant, he's spying on me. He's just trying to imply that I shouldn't be leaving the office again. Those are all the things going on in her head. So I'm sorry, I gave you an A or B choice, but I'm telling you, it's option B. Once they get into the conflict spiral, she's going to see him in a negative way. So that's the villain perspective. And think about it for yourself. When you are walking down the hall and your nemesis at work says good morning, do you really trust that? Or do you think they're going to end up asking you for something later in the day? One of my favorite examples of this, I had a case where two employees were fighting with each other. And one of the employees said to me in private, I found out that he was in a band, and I thought that might be fun to connect with him in some other way so we can build more rapport. So I asked him about the band and what he's doing. I met with him later and he said, you know what, Chris? She was talking to me about my band, asking me questions. I think she's trying to get more ammunition to use against me. So it's just no matter what you do, once you're in the conflict spiral, it's hard not to see the other person in that kind of victim or that vilifying perspective. So that's the third barrier. And the last one is a little more esoteric, but it's important to understand that when conflict gets through these first three stages, you end up with this bonfire. So you're seeing this huge bonfire here. And look, if you try to find out what started this conflict and you poke around inside that fire to figure out what started this thing, it's going to be hard to tell anymore, because now you got all this other stuff piled on top of it, and the fire and the conflict and the consternation has all grown, so that it's not just one thing anymore, but it's all those points along the way of the conflict spiral that has made it get, to use the technical term, worser and worser. So if you think about what started the conflict, it's helpful to reflect on that and think about the Ted and Shelley situation. What really started that? And I'll share with you that at the beginning, Ted wanted some ability to have meaning in his job, to come to work and be productive, to be valued for what he does. He basically wanted what all of us want, is to go to work and feel like we're contributing and that our work has some meaning. Instead, he was being chipped away and chipped away. And now we have this mob mentality where you have two sides against each other. You have the boss involved, the boss's boss involved, you have HR involved, you have the potential for people to lose their jobs and livelihood. It's a bonfire. So all of that started with something that grew out of control. So let's have a little quick quiz here. I'd like you to think about what the four barriers are, just for yourselves, and reflect on that. What are the four barriers and how do they play out? All right, here you go. It goes like this, basically. He violated my expectations, so I'm a victim. Plus, he's just a horrible person. And the conflict has grown out of control based on these first three elements being in place and having played out. So that's how conflict becomes so intractable and so challenging. Okay, we can all take a deep breath here. And that's the worst part of the presentation in terms of looking at the bad stuff. We're going to shift now to how to resolve these things. And I have a lovely quote here from John Gardner, former Secretary of Health. Don't worry, I had never heard of him either, but he has a great quote, which is, "We're continuously faced with a series of great opportunities, brilliantly disguised as insoluble problems." All right, so all of those barriers that we've just gone through, we're going to actually work through those, and each of those has the key to resolution built into it. Pretty powerful assertion that I'm making there, but I want to give you some confidence that, as bad as it looks, each of those barriers has a way out, and I'm going to give you the techniques to get there. All right, so first we have to take a little sidebar trip here, though. We need to talk about this concept of impartiality, and for this section in particular, I'm talking to those of you in leadership roles and HR, et cetera, where you're helping other people resolve their conflicts. And this is a skill that you have to become skillful in order to be effective in helping your employees and people that you're assisting within your organizations to resolve their conflict. So I'd like to ask you all a question: do you feel like you're neutral within your organization? Are you completely able to sit on the fence there and see both sides? And do you think that people see you in that light? Do they see you as a neutral within your organization?
Somebody say no, try to. A couple people are saying try to be. It's not easy. A few people are saying yes and yes, leave so.
Okay, cool. Thank you. So that concept of impartiality and neutrality is an important thing we need to drill down to a little bit. I'm going to break some bad news to you here, and that is that none of us are actually neutral. I am a professional, outside, third-party neutral. That's actually a term used to describe mediators. But I know enough to know that I'm actually not neutral, that I'm like any other person that still has a heartbeat and some blood pumping through my brain. And I'm going to have opinions and points of view and perspective and reactions to people. So we're not actually neutral. You can't be neutral and still be alive. And I'll give you an example. I had a case where an employee came in to mediate with management, and the manager had with him a file that was that thick, and it was full of customer complaints against this employee, customer complaints. And the employee still was convinced that management had a vendetta against her. Okay, now do I sound like I had an opinion there that maybe this employee might benefit from some objectivity that customers were complaining? Okay, yes, I had an opinion. But the key to good resolution and to be effective as a resolver of other people's conflict is to be impartial, because you can act impartially. You can't be neutral, but you can act impartially. And there's great power in this, and we're going to walk through this a little bit on why that's such a powerful perspective. So First of all, just get it out of your mind. You can't be neutral, but you can be impartial. The power of it is that going back 425 years or whatever the number is to Blaise Pascal, is that people are generally persuaded by reasons they themselves have discovered than those that have come into the minds of others. The idea here, obviously, is that you want to work with people to allow them to come up with their own solution to their own problem. What this means is, in practice, that to be an effective conflict resolver for other people, you need to facilitate and help them work through the issues in a way that's going to work for them on the job and to be more successful going forward. If you allow this to happen, then really remarkable things can happen. I had a case where there were two employees out of peers. They went into mediation, and one of the things they discovered that was really getting in their way was that one of the two was highly favored by their mutual boss. And so one of the things they decided to do was to jointly go back to the boss and sit down with her and say, look, it's not working for us that you are favoring person X here. And that was a really powerful moment for them to be able to jointly go to the boss and say that. My point in bringing this up is that I could not have suggested that in a way that would have maintained my neutrality or impartiality. And I probably wouldn't have come up with that idea because it seems really risky. But they themselves were able to come up with that solution, and they were able to put that forward. I've seen that play out hundreds, thousands of times in mediations where solutions they came up with aren't ones that I would have thought of, even if I had mediated for 100 years straight. I still wouldn't have thought of it, but for them it worked. So it's extremely powerful. It's an extremely effective way to help people solve their conflict. Now, look, folks, I know that it's not easy to do this. I can speak because I'm an outside mediator. You are in the trenches there, right? You are expected, and at times you're in that role where you have to come up with a solution or a decision and solve it and keep it solved. And that is why I am suggesting to you all to try impartial regard. Because it is a powerful tool. It has more teeth ultimately than the directive, prescriptive approach that so many managers and HR professionals and others fall into kind of naturally, to want to tell, to want to direct, when in fact, the more powerful, potent, lasting solution is going to come up if they themselves are able to solve it for themselves. So, two things to remember here. Number one is just use temporary impartiality. If you can't stay impartial the whole time, front load it into your interaction, see how far you can get with it before you have to make a decision. And the other one is to allow the solution to emerge from the parties. That's the meta point on this one. So that sounds easy to talk about, but it is hard to do, which is why we're going to go back to those 4 barriers and help you navigate your way out of those. All right, so we're going to revisit those, but I'm going to give you a new case that'll help you think about this dynamic in another way. So I had an employee and 2 supervisors in an organization, real high up in the organization. One named Julie, and she's sitting in her office. She has a couple of staff sitting there with her. And there's the proverbial knock on the door. Seems all my stories have the knock on the door, but in this case, it was more of a pounding. And she says, yes, come in. The door's closed, but what? And the door opens up and it's Hank standing there. And Hank is furious. You can just tell, read it all over him. He's mad. I got to talk to you right now. She's like, hold on, I'm here with a couple of staff and I'll get to you later. No, we're not going to do that. We're going to talk right now. She's taken aback against her better judgment. She gets up, goes across the hall, and he lays into her with, I can't believe you sent an email. I can't believe you backed out of this project. We've been working on this for 6 months and you end the whole thing with an email, a 3-sentence email. That's ridiculous. This is just not unprofessional, blah, blah, blah. You can hear the script going back and forth. She defends herself, and this relationship really sours from there. Again, by the time we get into there, you got 2 highly placed people in an organization with their whole teams aligned against each other, stirred up by this dynamic between these 2. All right. So let's think about the rules here that were violated, because we're going to use this new case to talk about the solutions. So what were some of Hank's rules? What were some of Julie's rules?
Don't communicate important decisions via email, open communication, talk in person, don't email. Lots of should have communicated in person, not by email. Yep.
Okay, good. Yeah. So it's deal with things immediate. For Hank, it's deal with it immediately, directly. Don't hide behind an email. For Julie, it's don't chastise me in front of other staff. Don't approach me in a way that's abrasive and hot and even physically intimidating. That's just not going to work for me as well. So that's the contrast between how the 2 saw it. So let's go back then to our scenario and think about this from the perspective of violated expectations. So the question for us is, if those are the expectations that people have, what's the solution? How do you solve that idea? And I'll give you a hint here. Remember, I said they weren't explicit. They weren't known in advance. And so how do we deal with violated expectations? And the answer I'll give to you is relatively straightforward here, which is reveal and deal with the rules. Make it explicit, put it out on the table, have it be part of the conversation, and put it into the mix so that you're changing the conversation from you did this, you did that, to what would you have preferred? What was your expectation? How do you want people to treat you? In fact, here I have a whole bunch of other questions for you that help you think about what this sounds like in practice for the conflict resolver. What specifically would you like her to do differently? Why did you find it so frustrating when she did blank? And what is she asking you to change about how you communicate with her? So we're making explicit and overt what otherwise is hidden and just hurt. So that's quite powerful way to navigate your way out of this part. So people have unstated rules, you bring them to the surface. And when you bring them to the surface with these kinds of questions, then there are a couple things that you can do once you know what the other person's expectations are. There are really three options to oversimplify this. One is you can reject it and say, here, that's what you need, but I'm not going to give it to you, which is rare. Even in the worst cases we get, people rarely say, I'm not going to meet your need at all. So that one's rare. We can toss it out most of the time. Another one is they can comply. They can, oh, I didn't know that having email communications on sensitive things was so challenging for you. I won't do that in the future. They comply. And the third option, what people spend a lot of time doing then, is negotiating some middle ground. So in the case between Hank and Julie, for example, Julie might say, well, look, I'm intimidated by you sometimes. If I could just send a pre-email telling you I need to talk to you about something sensitive and hint at what the topic might be, we schedule a time to do it, blah, blah, blah. You can hear the negotiation then happening. As long as that's revealed and we ask these questions, we put it out on the table, then we can negotiate about it. So that's the power of trying to work through that by revealing and dealing with the expectations. All right. Number two we talked about was the idea of victimhood. So there are two parts to solving victimhood. And the first one requires that we think about acknowledging the feelings that the person has as a fact. And if you think about when I set that one up originally for you all, I really emphasize this idea that they are feeling that way authentically, genuinely. It's a real concern for them. They're not just scapegoating and making themselves look good, but they are genuinely feeling like a victim. And so how do we deal with people that are feeling like victims? We listen to them, all right? You just listen to them so that they feel heard. And folks, you know how to do all this stuff, right? You active listening, eye contact, verbal, nodding your head, summarizing, all that stuff. You know that's level 100, level 200 stuff. And you already know how to do that. But there's a deeper trick here to this material, and it's the uncommon knowledge that I want to share with you today. And it's why we listen, is that we listen to them so they will listen to us as the resolver. So we want to build rapport, build a relationship with the person that you're trying to help through the conflict. And you do that by front-loading good active listening and doing that in an effective way. Once you've done that, you've created a successful environment where you've effectively earned permission to sow doubt. So this might seem like strange advice coming from a professional peacemaker, but part of my job is to try to sow a little bit of doubt that the person who's feeling like 100% the victim and the other person's 100% culprit, that we want to shake that up a little bit, because I guarantee you in most workplace conflict, there is mutual culpability. Both sides have done something to do harm to the other. That's not always true. Some people are out to do harm to others, and those don't belong in negotiation or mediation. They belong in a more disciplinary type process. But for the vast majority of conflict that we're all going to encounter, there's actually some shared blame. And so the idea here is to start to build some uncertainty in the person, build some curiosity, come up with the idea that there might be alternative explanations for why the other person did what they did and said what they did. I'll tell it to you this way. A negotiator's job, if you're selling a car or a boat or whatever, your job is to place doubt in the other person's mind about the value of the item. If you're buying it or if you're selling it, to try to jack the price up by placing doubt in the other person's mind about, oh, maybe this feature is better than and worth more than I thought. A mediator's job, a conflict resolver's job, is to place doubt in everybody's mind. to get both sides to not be so darn sure that their perspective is 100% accurate. And we do that by listening to them, by helping them have a different perspective. And we can do it with questions like these. If we could redo that conversation, what would you do differently this time? To help them reflect back on, let's see, yeah, I shouldn't have pounded on the door. I shouldn't have been so defensive. I shouldn't have this or that or the other. It helps them start to rattle their confidence and to start thinking about it from another perspective. When I always love this one. When I talk to him, what's he likely say about you? And that one can be quite powerful. I asked that of a client once after I had spent 45 minutes doing the good listening stuff. I asked her that, and she said, she'll say, I'm unprofessional, unprepared, and disorganized. And I had enough rapport at that point. I was able to say, and which of those rang true for you? And now she's able to reflect. And she said, I can be pretty disorganized. So now she and I are talking about her disorganization, her inability to be effective, and how that's influencing members of her team. So asking a question like that after you've done the good listening up front can help sow some doubt and create a more open space for them to have a conversation about how we can all be more organized to be more effective for the team. So that's the questions that can be quite powerful. All right, when we go back to the Shelley and Ted case, what thing that I found interesting there was that Ted went to the boss because he felt that boss was approachable and he had some rapport with the boss, and just wanted an informal private conversation. The director took that information, heard the word violence, and really overplayed his hand and caused a lot of consternation for them as individuals and for the organization generally. It turned out in the mediation, it finally came out that Ted's number one regret was going to the boss. So the thing she was most upset about was the thing, and we only got there because we created a safe space for them to be able to have that conversation. All right, so two things that we're focusing on here in victimization is deep impartial listening, which you already know how to do, and doing it with kind of some intent here to be able to sow doubt. All right, continuing our journey, I'd like you to think of the third level of conflict that we were looking at, and that is vilification. And I put up this kind of goofy slide to show you that most people in most organizations are somewhere in the middle here between these two characters that you're seeing. You need to be able to help people reveal and think about the other person as a person and to explore alternative explanations for what they are saying or why they're acting in a certain way, and to help them really be more human with each other. And so we do that by asking questions like, what would a reasonable person do and why would they do that? And then wait for an answer. So it's a Dr. Phil kind of question. Why would he do that? Why would they do that? And then wait for an answer so that they can be more reflective about the other person. Some other questions that are in this spirit are, why might they say that? What message were you hoping to convey when you did that? And what do you appreciate about each other? That last question might seem risky in a mediation that's gotten really hot, but I ask that often, and it's powerful that people, even in the most heated conflicts that we get, are still able to highlight things that they appreciate about the other person. So those are some helpful ways of navigating your way out of vilification. And then the last one is what's really important. So you'll recall that it was all about buried root cause. You saw the bonfire, that there was this piece in the center of that started it, the one match that started it. And so one of the things we do as effective conflict resolvers is to go back in and try to figure out what is really important to you in this. Forget all the other things, the files and the chairs and the desk and everything else that were thrown on there to build the fire bigger. What at the core of this was really important to you at the beginning? And that skillful resolver that you all are going to be after this presentation is going to ask questions like why. So why was that important to you? Why did you first come forward with that proposal? Here's some other questions. What were your core concerns? Just ask them straight out. You're making this proposal. This is how you want this solved. Tell us why that's important to you. Tell the other person why you think that's important. And what do you want to achieve when this whole thing began? So those are questions that are rooted, and you can extrapolate from there and come up with dozens of questions that get back to what is really important to people in the situation. So those are some ways to think about going back, digging deeper, and figuring it out. In the Ted and Shelley case, the core thing that it turned out in that one was that Ted wanted to be valued. And he had this theory that he had come up with in his experience with Shelley that she just really didn't want him her administrative assistant, that she had inherited him from a previous supervisor. And she was able to look him in the eye and very convincingly say, absolutely not true, Ted. I wanted you. I've enjoyed working with you. I thought we even had rapport outside of work a little bit. And I wanted this to work from the beginning. And I'm just trying to redefine your role. I didn't know it was so impactful, et cetera, et cetera. It absolutely fundamentally changed their dynamic with each other. All right, so the insights here are to refocus on the initial problem, but don't ignore all the other stuff that's been piled on since then. So you really have to work through that stuff as well, the aftermath from the initial thing that wasn't met for either side, and do that by revealing what really matters. All right, folks, we're close to the end here, so I want to give you a chance to reflect on the journey we've taken together. And this is a private, in your own workplace moment here to jot down the 4 barriers and the 4 solutions. Yes, there is a quiz. It's a pass fail. And I'm hoping that you're all going to get A+. So if you can recall the 4 solutions, I'll give you the answer in 3, 2, 1. All right. First one is violated expectations. That's the triggering event in conflict. So our job is to reveal and deal with the expectations that have been violated. Number 2, victimization. People feel like victims when the other violates, and then the solution is to listen, to acknowledge that, so that you can help them feel heard, and you can ask questions that rattle their conviction about their victimization a little bit when that's the case. Number 3 is vilification. That if that's the barrier, what's the solution? The solution is to develop alternative explanations for what the other person is doing, why they might have done what they did. It's the old intent versus impact thing. So trying to help people see that. And then finally, the buried root cause. And that is, there's something that triggered it, and finding out what that is, putting that on the table and having that be explicit and worked through is quite powerful. All right. So that brings us very close to the end. Wanted to share with you all that after the presentation today, you'll get an opportunity to sign up on our newsletter, and we're putting out topics or some of the headlines for you and some of the newsletters we put out for free. If you're interested, you can hit an opt-in on the email you'll get from Mulberry. And so I'm hopeful that you all got some tools that will help you be more effective in your conflict resolution experiences ahead, and that you will wade into your next conflict feeling a little more confident, having some more skills and insights, and that you feel more prepared. So hope you feel that and you got some of that from our conversation today. I want to thank you all for being here and appreciate Mulberry for having us all, bringing us all together.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. And here on this final slide is just ways that you can connect with Lauren, Chris, and myself. You're welcome to email any of us or email Chris any questions if you have any follow-up questions, and then connect with us on LinkedIn. And we're so happy that you all joined us today. We know that you have many options when it comes to webinars, and we are so happy that you chose ours. So thank you, everybody. And thank you, Chris and Lauren.
Thank you, Chris, for joining us today. We're just so happy that you had an opportunity to share your experiences with our audience, and we are getting just an avalanche of thank yous. So very helpful to many people, and your words rang true for many of us today. So thanks so much.
Lovely. Thank you, Lauren. Appreciate it, Kelsey. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Bye, everyone.
And being with us today. Bye-bye.